Feeling a slight warmth on his cheek, Therin stopped and looked to the canopy above, and to his surprise, Sol had pierced the heavens. Yet it was only for a moment, for the chilling wind soon returned, and the sun's rejuvenating light would be forced back behind the churning clouds far sooner than he would have liked. Winds calming and snow fading, Therin wondered if his luck might have turned, and soon found himself hopeful that he may have avoided what was starting to look more and more like a blizzard. Yet in the end, it did not make for much difference, for his journey had already ground to what felt like a painfully slow crawl, for he was stifled by the ever-thickening undergrowth, and more significantly, a thick covering of snow that hid its complexity behind the chaos of every step, making everyone taken hampered by the care and thought it would need to take the next. Although having to move at such a slow pace allowed him to collect the few, yet powerful medicinal plants that only bloomed in the snow, of which some performed particularly good at taking the edge off of head pains, like those left over from an especially nasty sleep, much like the one he had experienced the previous night. Yet he thought it's not so bad, for on the brighter side, it had allowed him to take in the entire breadth of the indescribable surroundings he now found himself in. Distracted as he pressed down into his next footstep, Therin suddenly felt the ground give way beneath him and he fell. Thrashing about as he descended, Therin stuck his hands out wide in hopes to balance himself, and thankfully with a little effort he again found his footing. Taking a breath, he looked around and noticed something quite strange as just past the slight crest in front of him, and behind a partially hidden dense section of the forest were the trunks of several trees completely turned over. Moving to the largest of the group, Therin brushed away the thick layer of snow, revealing that the trees had not simply fallen in the storm, for upon its hefty trunk he noted several large gashes torn deep into the heart of this particularly hard species of ironwood tree. Unable to see how the damage could have been caused by an axe, or in fact any tool he could imagine, Therin quickly deduced that maybe they were toppled by the creature from earlier. Following them like a trail, Therin carefully inspected each tree and recognized the same sort of damage on every one of them. Yet there was something that vexed him. Some of the trees had sustained damage in all sorts of unusual places and degrees. Some of them were cleaved completely in two, while others sustained damage at unusual angles and height, but some seemed to have been completely shattered as if by blunt force alone. Perplexed and a little scared, Therin continued further, but doubt slowly but surely creeped in as the damage on the trees grew ever more destructive the further he came. Suddenly questioning his own sanity and reason for wanting to find whatever caused all this damage, Therin noticed the light of dusk shining brightly over a clearing a few meters east. Heart pounding, he stepped timidly through the undergrowth as he continued south, until finally he reached a slight rise in the forest's floor, but still he could not see into the clearing as well as he would like. Trying to get a better vantage point over the area, Therin shifted his weight and lowered his body into a crouch as he moved toward what he thought was a stable outcropping. Looking over the clearing, Therin could only make out what appeared to be more fallen trees and shrubs buried by a particularly thick covering of snow. Leaning over the edge, he wondered if he should take a closer look, yet as he moved to pull himself back, the rocky foundation beneath him gave way and he immediately fell. Tumbling, turning, and making a whole lot of noise, Therin finally came to a rest behind a half-turned tree, right on the edge of the clearing. Lifting his hand to his head, he brushed the snow from his face, but just as he did, he noticed a large portion of the snow slowly rising and falling, like a massive blanket. Therin gasped as the snow beneath his foot suddenly shifted, and a clear snap from a broken branch reverberated across the now eerily quiet clearing. Calculating the clearing's size in his mind, Therin couldn't believe what he was looking at, for the mound of snow would have to be at least 10 meters across. Rising for a third time, a portion of the snow fell away, revealing 3 massive feathers protruding from the snowy cover, each at least half the size of a man. Over the far side of the clearing, a large clump of snow dislodged from a tall tree and fell to the ground with a thump. Therin waited, thinking there was no way whatsoever that the thing who might be hiding or maybe sleeping under the snow would ignore these 3 very distinct sounds that alone might be passed off as happenstance. But together, even he would be very suspicious something must be about. Chest pounding from a potent mix of fear and curiosity, Therin looked on in wonder as the snow methodically shifted about in a strange circular motion without a care in the world, almost like a cat trying to get comfortable again after being rudely pulled from its slumber. Suddenly a wing broke free of its snowbound prison in a misty white haze, yet it was immediately obvious that it was no simple wing nor creature as a whole, for it was far larger than anything he had seen before. Suddenly, another part of the snow to the far side rose up, although barely visible at first, a feathery tail, not unlike that of a cat streaked free from the snow, and begun to sway with a blistering lethality. although as he observed a little longer, a distinct irritation seemed to emerge from its motion. Therin watched in complete bewilderment as the tail flicked and swayed to and fro. But soon a further section of snow began to bulge, but this time it was barely 10 meters away. Eyes wide at the enormous head of an eagle softly emerging from the veil, Therin eyed a small clump of snow hanging stubbornly to the eagle's head. With a swift yet simple motion, the enormous creature quickly shook itself free from any embarrassment, and as the snow settled, its silver-gold head began to reflect brilliantly in the golden light of dusk. With its ears curved and exuding a cat-like poise, the creature looked around at its surroundings before eerily settling on the overturned tree that Therin now found himself hiding behind. Softening its posture, the creature turned back, lifting itself up in a single motion as it moved around the hole its body had just left. Snow still falling from its thick shifting coat, Therin looked on, unable to believe his eyes were witnessing the full glory and majesty of its mythical form. With great presence, the creature's imposing wings suddenly reached out and up to the heavens. Its long feline-like body of feathers and fur stretched out in an arching motion as they stood on end. All the while its tail continued to sway about in what seemed a methodical, yet somehow brazen manner. Completely bewildered, Therin watched, unable to look away, but to his surprise the creature suddenly staggered as it tried to turn in the opposite direction. Its grace failing, the creature fell back to the ground, releasing a high-pitched wail. Clawing at its hind leg, Therin finally noticed a black metallic chain wrapped around its massive limb. At its end lied several massive weights the size of a decent anvil. Appalled, Therin's engineering mind pondered on the thought as to what kind of contraption could throw something so preposterous into the air, let alone have it travel any significant distance to bring down a creature of such size. Pulled from the thought by the sounds of metal chains clashing once again, Therin watched as the creature wrestled with its bonds. Feeling an intense sadness, Therin couldn't help but look for a way to help the creature, but no matter how hard he thought on the matter, he couldn't figure a way to approach. How could he ever know if it was in its nature to harm him? And by the size of the creature's claws, there was a very real chance that it could be an aggressive species. Frozen by the sound of branches cracking behind him, Therin ducked back down as he swiftly turned to see what it was. To his horror, his eyes fell on the antlers of the buck from earlier. Resisting the urge to shrink back to the safety of the tree, Therin attempted to remain still and watched, waiting for any signs the animal might charge. Mind racing, he kept trying to think of a way out. Usually he would try to back away slowly and put as much space between them as possible, but he was stuck between a full-size buck and a creature he knew very little about. Suddenly the buck began to lower its head, effectively taking the choice out of his hands. Therin attempted to dart sideways, yet his footing was less than desirable, and he slipped over the damp ground and fell tumbling. Regaining his feet, he tried to disguise his presence, but a high-pitched roar proved it all too late. Arms open, Therin slowly turned and looked to the creature who was already staring at him with its deep, piercing eyes. Hearing the panicked trampling of hooves scurrying away, Therin's heart threatened to pound out of his chest. Hearing the commotion, the creature's head turned a little and looked past him, catching only a faint blur of a stag's tail as it darted off into the forest. With the disruption gone from sight, the creature turned its full focus back to Therin, its interest renewed. Seeing nowhere to go, Therin held hope that if he helped this creature in its moment of need, it would let him leave with his life. Mustering all the courage he could, Therin stretched out the fingers in his right hand and pointed to the metal chain wrapped around the creature's leg, hoping this was symbolic enough to show his intentions. The creature slowly followed his hand to its hind leg, but darted back soon after replying with what can only be described as a chirp. Unsure as to how to proceed, Therin waited and tried to observe, hoping time would give him an out. But after a long few minutes, the creature let out a loud sudden roar that forced Therin back. Composing himself again the best that he could, Therin stepped forward in as diplomatical fashion as possible. Yet with every step taken, he wondered if it might be his last, but one after the other he moved closer, and eventually he stood within reaching distance. To his great relief, the creature did not move nor make any sign of aggression. It simply watched, darting back and forth between Therin and its hind leg. Anxious, he slowly placed his left hand on the chain, but just as he did, a crippling chill rushed up his arm. Wrenching it back, Therin looked for any signs of injury, but to his relief it appeared to be okay. Therin wondered for a moment, curious as to what it could have been, but the gravity of the situation quickly made him realize it most likely didn't matter near as much as the giant feline bird now staring at him. Again he reached for the chain, except this time he used both hands and pulled upon them in such a way that the knot loosened slightly. Therin persisted for a time, But no matter how hard he tried, it would not loosen completely, and to make things that little more infuriating, the moment he let go of the chain, it would again tighten. Refusing to give up, he looked to the creature apologetically for what he was about to do, and turned to retrieve the strip of leather from his bag. Pulling the chain away from the creature's skin a second time, Therin wrapped the leather around its leg to create a sort of barrier between the chain and the creature's skin. Realizing he was breathing heavily, he stopped a moment and looked around for a suitable branch. Finding just the right one, he pulled it from the ground and ran his hand along its length to remove any protruding branch that might get in the way. Raising a brow, he turned to the creature again, hoping to give it at least some warning as to what he was about to do. Waiting but a moment, he then placed it between the leather and the chain to create some space. Doing the same 3 more times at different places along the leg, Therin began sliding the chain from the foot, but as he continued, an array of large jagged hooks sprung from within the links themselves, in what he could only assume was an attempt to prevent any effort of removing the chain by force. Thankfully, they found no worthwhile anchor, as the branches did a passing job of keeping the spikes away from the skin. Trying to get a closer look at the mechanism, Therin suddenly pulled away, as one of the barbs began to extend, further digging into both the leather and the branches with alarming ease. Feeling a sudden pain from his right hand, Therin looked down at his palm now dripping with blood. Clenching his fist, he moved to rip off a stretch of fabric, when suddenly he heard a strange sound coming from where he just was. Looking back to the chain, he realized that the section that had cut him had begun to shake furiously. Watching keenly, Therin looked on in amazement as it began to shift, as it bubbled and boiled unlike anything he had ever seen. For a long minute, Therin could do little more than stare, frozen in time, unable to process what he was witnessing, for it had been a day full of the impossible. Suddenly a streak of fear for the creature's well-being dawned on him, but to his surprise it too was watching, bewildered at the sight, yet there was no fear in its eyes. Above, a light snow had begun to fall, its white starry flakes quickly dissolving into the crimson of his blood. Before long the shaking in the chain stopped, and without warning, it suddenly fell to the ground, shattering as if it were but ice. Reaching down, Therin picked up one of the larger chunks of what he thought was metal, but it was no longer the cold, sturdy material it once appeared to be. Closing his fist, the chunk broke apart and fell through his fingers like chalk. Brushing the last of its remains from his hand, Therin looked back to the creature as it attempted to pull itself to its feet, yet as it tried, its back leg could hardly bear the weight. Recognizing the pain, Therin turned and walked over to a large pine tree at the edge of the clearing. In smooth motions, he slid his hand over the trunk, searching for sap. Finding just the spot, he pulled the dagger from his belt and carefully pushed it into the trunk of the tree. Allowing a moment for the sap to flow, Therin collected a sizable portion of its golden liquid and then returned to the waiting creature, who bore a clearly curious look on its face. Wiping the sap on a section of leather, Therin pulled a few medicinal plants out of his bag and sprinkled a good amount over the top before combining them together. Looking at the creature's back leg again, Therin knew he would have to clean the wound somehow, yet he also knew that it would most definitely hurt. So he turned to the creature in an effort to convey at least some warning. Yet as he did, Therin realized it was already looking at him, and had probably been watching him this whole time. The majestic creature simply looked down to Therin's hand, and then back to his face. Following its gaze, Therin realized the cut on his hand was still bleeding. Realizing that he could use this to convey the message, he pulled a piece of linen out of his bag and ripped away a strip. He then grabbed his water skin and rinsed the wound thoroughly, before applying a small portion of the sap to the bandage. Biting on a stray branch, Therin tightly wrapped it around his hand and then tied it off. Allowing the pain to show visibly in his expression, he again looked back up to the creature, pointing first to his hand, then to the creature's leg. Showing no intention one way or the other, the creature merely turned its head slightly and sat back down, but after a moment, it suddenly shook its head and looked back as it slowly began to extend its hind leg. Hoping that was the sign of agreement he was looking for, Therin grabbed his water skin and began rinsing the creature's large array of wounds as best he could. Letting out a faint sigh as he used the last bit of water he had, Therin came to the last wound and cleaned it thoroughly. Happy with the result, he quickly wrapped the medicinal concoction over the creature's leg and stepped back. Cautious, he looked the creature over for a time, for he was unsure as to how it would react once the ointment began its work, for he knew well the effect, and just as he expected, the creature's eyes suddenly widened, and it began to shake its head wildly. Giving his best empathetic smile, Therin waited for the creature's pain to abate before returning to the injury, rubbing what remained of the sap over the creature's leg, and then wrapping it with all the linen he had left. Exhausted, Therin fell back a short distance and dropped to the ground, resting his weary legs. Still unable to believe the reality of his eyes, Therin could only watch as the creature began preening its feathers. Yet it was not long before a sudden jolt of the creature's head made him realize he was still in the middle of a forest. Searching for what it was that drew the creature so, Therin realized he could hear a low rhythmic sound approaching from the west. Although soft at first, the sound steadily grew until finally it shut out all other distractions. Leaning forward, Therin could barely believe that not one, but two of these majestic creatures could be out here in the forest. Heart again pounding as he watched, Therin caught the very tip of a wing flashing past the edge of the clearing, its speed defying imagination. Ears perked, the creature sitting in the middle of the clearing suddenly pulled itself from the ground, noticeably nimbler than before. Tail flicking, it quickly moved to make space, and to Therin's surprise it moved closer, stopping only a few feet from where he sat. The second mighty creature glided over again, but this time it lifted the snow into a fog that made it impossible to see anything beyond that which was directly in front of him. Mouth ajar, Therin could not believe the sheer force and size of the creature's wings as they moved in flight. Unexpectedly, the first creature reared its own mighty wings and blew the cloud of snow away in a single yet forceful motion. Moments later, the second creature returned and gracefully glided in, landing with a short trot as it came to a rounding stop. Circling on the spot in a clear show of intimidation, Therin found himself shrinking closer to the injured creature beside him. Coming to a standstill, the second creature puffed up its elegant silver wings and glared at Therin with this species' signature piercing eyes. Therin found himself beginning to step back in hope to defuse the situation, but the creature matched every move. Suddenly it stamped its mighty front paw into the ground in a clearly challenging manner, its giant claws tearing into the snow and dirt with alarming ease. Suddenly the first creature roared and rushed forward, nipping the newcomer right on the backside, in what Therin could only assume was some form of authority shown for his benefit. The newcomer immediately lowered itself to the ground, ears dropping as it let out a dramatically long laboured rush of air. Staring in pure disbelief, Therin could hardly believe what he had just witnessed, yet reality rarely waits for our disbelief to abate, and neither do these creatures, as the injured of the two quickly returned to him and presented its injured limb, insisting he should apply more of the balming agent. Applying the last of the healing salve and tightening the linen bandage, Therin stepped back and watched the two creatures, both of whom had already forgotten the previous scuffle and had now grown quite content as they chirped to one another. Eventually, the sun's very last sliver of light fell behind the horizon, and he knew he would have to leave soon, although he couldn't help but feel the time had come all too soon. For a time he had even considered camping the night, but something deep inside nagged at him, insisting that making camp in the forest would be a terrible decision. Suddenly thinking of his mother, Therin's stomach began to growl, so he retrieved the sack of snowberries from his pack and pulled a few out. Suddenly the sensation of eyes falling upon him sent a shiver running down his back. Growing uncomfortable, Therin slowly looked up from his meal and almost fell backwards. In the fading light, two sets of eyes suddenly blinked, and Therin realized that both the creatures were now staring directly at the tiny berries in his hand. Struggling to contain his laughter, he found a sturdy piece of bark and emptied the sack of berries onto it, saving just a few for himself. Waiting only for Therin to get out of the way, the once graceful feline eagle swiftly descended on the unsuspecting berries and devoured them in the blink of an eye. Still smiling, he raised his right hand and brushed the side of the creature's face. A deep purr quietly began to rumble from the creature, despite its injuries, and all the while the second nudged at his side, presumably wanting the same treatment. Lifting his other hand, he began to pat them both. Feeling a sudden pain, he realized his wound had opened again. Adjusting the bandage in an effort to stop the bleeding, Therin realized he had accidentally gotten some of his blood on both of the creatures, and to his surprise, the second creature had already begun to lick the blood from the side of its face. Eyes fully dilated, it suddenly stopped and slowly turned, until it finally settled its still gaze upon him. Not understanding what had just happened, Therin figured now was as good a time as any to leave, and began to gather his things. Constantly looking from one creature to the other, Therin suddenly felt very small, seeing as both their eyes were now staring directly at him. Yes, this would be the most ideal time to take my leave, he whispered to himself. Having gathered all he cared for, Therin started to move slowly towards his resting bow. With every step he felt more certain that he could feel the weight of their gaze growing as he moved further away. Sliding it over his shoulder, Therin raised his hand timidly to his heart. "Thank you." As his lips fell still, a sudden ringing of bells sounded in his ears. Yet it was so soft, he thought it surprising he even noticed it, for the wind too was beginning to howl. Moving away, Therin realized he had probably been smiling the entire time, so turned and raised his hand to wave one last time. I am honoured you allowed me to share this time with you." Heart pounding and stomach turning giddy from adrenaline and hunger, Therin turned, still sure he could feel their gaze upon his back as he disappeared into the forest, and just like they had begun, the bells fell silent.